So I'm here with Laura Flanders. She is the host of the Laura Flanders Show. She is a veteran commentator and award-winning journalist. I know because City Limits presented her with the Urban Journalist Award at our gala in 2019, which seems, of course, like about 10 years ago. Laura, welcome to City Limits. Nice to see you again.
Oh, it's great to see you, Jarrett. It's another year, amazing, amazing year.
It has been. It has been that. So we are almost 3 weeks from the presidential election. And of course, from the moment the votes began getting tallied, people were looking at what the significance is. How do you read the different results? How they met expectations, exceeded, fell short. Obviously, it's still early for any kind of deep historical analysis, but what is your take on the results you've seen so far?
You mean my shallow A historical analysis?
Yes, that's what we're paying for. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, some things have been entirely unexpected, which is, the Donald Trump tantrums, unexpected, an enormous focus of media attention. But I think nothing that we couldn't have predicted. Will that fizzle out pretty soon? I anticipate it will, at least at the level that we're thinking about challenges to election results and so forth. Will his continuing sort of rabble rousing of his particular rabble continue? Absolutely. I don't think that's going anywhere. But I think where we sit at the moment is the attention that's been getting has taken away from the attention that might have gone to scrutinizing the Democratic results, the Democratic Party results. And that's a pity because there's a lot to be learned there. So on the one hand, unsurprising. On the other hand, I think a lot of people were surprised that there wasn't the kind of blue tsunami that they had expected.
Right, exactly.
Particularly at the level of the House, not just not gaining seats, but not losing them, and then not making the kind of flip of the Senate that people hoped for. While we're talking, Georgia's 2 seats in the Senate are still up for grabs, but the Republicans probably have the edge there. We don't know. And if my inbox is like your inbox, I'm still flooded with messages from Nancy Pelosi saying everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I don't think that's quite the case, but the money raising goes on. The alarm bells keep ringing on the fundraising side, and the deep analysis of where the Democrats actually fell short this time, I think, has yet to come.
So I guess the early read on, as you said, Joe Biden did win a very solid popular vote victory. He appears to have a decent sized electoral college victory. But in a lot of states, it was closer than the last polls predicted. And as you mentioned, the House, the Democrats lost some seats. The Senate, they picked up some, but they do not appear likely to flip it, or if they do, just by the vote of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. That has been taken as a critique implicitly of the progressive wing of the party and the way that it shaped the conversation around some issues this summer, and going back even further around things like the Green New Deals, the Black Lives Matter conversation, defund the police, Green New Deal. Do you think there's any value in that?
Well, you'll be surprised to hear I don't agree with the critique. Whether there's value in it, there's always value in fighting this stuff out. But no, I mean, I'll tell you, I do a weekly show on public television, and one of the first people that I reached out to after the election was Amy Allison, She the People. She was one of those organizing Black women, especially, to finally get their due in this election. And her immediate take out of the gate is the one that rings most true to me, which is what was surprising about this election was the continuity rather than the change in the balance of power between the Democrats and the Republicans. Yes, everybody's turnout increased because we actually made it easier for people to vote. Wow, what an idea. But the balance in power remained tighter than people had anticipated. She says, look at the few places where there were shifts in the Democrats' direction, and it was entirely thanks to organizing in Arizona among the Latinx population and indigenous populations that have been fighting like heck against evictions, against police brutality, against ICE deportations, going back to the organizing around the brutal Sheriff Joe Arpaio, Philadelphia, Detroit. These are heart centers of the Black liberation movement and the anti-eviction movement, places that have historic social justice organizing. And that's also true of Georgia and the South. So where the changes were seen, and there were fewer of them than we might have anticipated, it was thanks to embedded organizing going back decades, and particularly fueled, I think, by both the pandemic and the personality and policies of Donald Trump. not really fueled, I wouldn't say, by inspiration from the Biden-Harris ticket. But, that's an old story. It's a story we continue to tell, and a story that we have to keep telling as independent media. As usual, the Biden campaign chose to follow a very Clintonite kind of approach to the election. Instead of appealing to those activists and really digging down deep into those sort of reservoirs of excitement, they kind of went for begging Republicans to come their way and give them a second look. And I think you and I would both agree that that's an old and not very successful model, at least as those of us who care about moving the progressive needle in a progressive direction, and pushing this country into grappling with kind of some of its core problems.
Well, that's a great point. The idea that, I mean, I think one of the kind of takeaways on election night was that Trump and his people had a much better ground game than I think Democrats thought. And I think what you're saying is true, that where Democrats did break through, it's not really a strategic question of issues or messaging, but just the kind of old-fashioned tactical organizing people, getting people to meetings, getting people out to vote, where they invested time and energy in that, they got the results they wanted.
Although what I think I'm also saying is that activists, who were many of them investing in new ways of organizing and new ways of getting out the vote, made the difference for the Democrats, who were pretty much singing the same old song.
What are you seeing so far from the Biden camp? Obviously, the transition is a little awkward in the sense that the person who lost the election hasn't conceded yet. Some of the, machinations of that typically occur are not happening, but we're starting to see Biden. Obviously, we saw his election night, or I should say, a week later address claiming victory. We've seen some of his early appointments. Are you seeing any signals in terms of how he's going to approach this, the direction of his administration, how it's taking shape? Do any of those clash with your expectations? What are the signals so far from Biden?
I have to say I have not scrutinized the cabinet list fully yet, but there are no names that jump out and no sort of attention-getting appointments that really excite me. I mean, I will say that the COVID task force includes some good people that take a rights approach to pandemic research and vaccination, public health. There are some good people on that task force, and that's great, but it's a big task force. We don't know whose voice will be loudest. But I think what a lot of people are looking for is the kind of cabinet that would help catalyze we really need a systemic shift in the way that we address our systemic problems. I mean, people talk about COVID revealing the fissures in American society. The fissures are enormous, whether you're talking housing, education, healthcare, safety, environment. What I'm not seeing is the kind of approach and language coming from the Biden administration that is fit for purpose in these times. I mean, we need an FDR style for the 21st century approach to some of what's been happening in the last, certainly 12 months, but this is decades in the making. We need a clear break with the sort of trickle-down neoliberalism, society is really just a market approach, that could reinscribe some sense of society, some sense of we the people as more than consumers, of value in society being measured not just in speculative prices of Wall Street investments and housing, but of how healthy our society actually is, and the web of relationships that we rely on, and learned how we relied on them during this pandemic. So am I seeing that kind of shift and break? No, not yet. Does that worry me? Yes. Does the attack on progressives right out of the gate that you just mentioned worry me? Yes. But there's some exciting organizing. Might we get Deb Haaland, a Native American organizer from the Southwest, nominated to Interior Secretary? That would be right, and it would be fantastic. Will it happen? We'll find out. We'll see.
Do you think, I mean, obviously some of the backlash to progressives and some of that conversation broke out in this conference call that's been reported on among members of the House, I think on November 4th or 5th. And that's one question, I guess, is however Biden is going to approach this, whether Congress will push him or pull him one way or the other. Obviously, there are voices like AOC, others in the House, and maybe some counterparts in the Senate. Do you see the legislature pushing Biden to a more progressive agenda, Or do you feel as though as a body, they're going to be cautious about that?
I'm afraid as a body, we're going to see more of the same, partly because the power of Nancy Pelosi remains the same. But we are in a different place than we were last time Joe Biden was in the White House. If you go back 12 years to the beginning of the Obama administration, we were in a similar crisis financially. We were in a similar kind of moment of turmoil where people were calling for a real change of approach. People, not profits. It gave birth eventually to the Occupy movement. What has changed is that we do have that cohort of organized progressive electeds, both at the House level with AOC and Ilhan, and they've got some new members now. And they have their equivalents in the states, and I think that it's important that we, I wrote a commentary every couple of weeks, and the last one was about the quadrennial media eclipse of We the People. Like in every election year, you have like a few months of coverage where people matter, and you get reporters interviewing people over their breakfast in New Hampshire and Iowa. And then they disappear, and all of our focus goes back to Pennsylvania Avenue. Right. I think and City Limits knows that much of the most valuable policy that we see ever emerge at the national level has its roots in local struggle and local organizing and local legislative wins and city council victories. We're right now following the housing struggle that's happening in Philadelphia, where there's some really interesting stuff happening, just as what happened in Oakland got headlines last year. So I don't really look to Washington to lead. We have to push. And even those legislators that make it into the House on the progressive side still need to be pushed, because from everything we've heard, DC is a very soul-destroying atmosphere. And if we don't keep the heat on people and keep the support at their back for doing the right thing, it's very easy to go with the flow.
Yeah, we'll see a test of that in New York City next year. We have our 2021 elections coming up, many open offices, including obviously the top one of mayor. And I think it'll be an interesting test to see how progressives and what kind of progressives emerge in that race, given what the city's been through, the economic challenges, the real fiscal constraints that are there, a feeling that management credentials are what need to be emphasized. And sometimes that can lead to kind of a counter ideology or a non-ideological approach. If you were covering the New York City mayoral race, what kind of issues would you be looking to be covering, and what should those candidates be talking about to try to advance not just a local issue, but maybe provide that national model?
Well, I mean, there's some amazing candidates. I don't want to go out on a limb and back any of them yet, but I'm in favor of some especially. You can look back and see which ones have made the most appearances on my show. And that's, of course, my arbiter for who I should back for office. But no, I mean, think about it. During the 1930s, you had what were called the sort of laboratories of democracy all across the country, which were local people figuring out how to help one another through mutual aid strategies survive a depression without government support, without corporate presence. And much of that became what FDR integrated into the New Deal: Social Security, electrification co-ops, unemployment insurance. This was all stuff that came out of local initiatives. So in New York, what do we have? We have initiatives around a Green New Deal. We have initiatives around locally controlled sustainable energy, alternative energy. I'd love to see how that develops. And I think that's a key issue. Are we going to allow the industries and the economy of the future to be in the same few hands as we've seen the economy of the past? Will the green economy, will the assets thereof and the wealth thereof be more equitably spread, the ownership thereof be more equitably spread? That's a real question in New York right now. And there are organizers, Uprose and others around the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, that are making a very strong case for community-owned green power. So that's one thing. Housing. We're seeing an eviction crisis about to hit this winter that I think we've never seen the likes of yet. And that's not a history record that you want to have. So I'm very interested also in the development of some of the land trusts that have been talked about for many years. The growth of the idea that you can have community-held public and social housing that sure allows people to own for their lifetime, but puts a limit on the speculation in housing. That's fascinating. We just did a piece on Buffalo and how they're experimenting with that initiative too. Healthcare, the way that New York rolls out its vaccination program and the way that public trust is built around that public health initiative will be all important. And there are people like Dr. Oxidis Barbeau, who we interviewed on the show a few weeks ago, who headed up the New York City initiative, health department at the beginning of COVID and during the measles epidemic last year,
Mhm.
who have a lot to teach the nation about how to actually do effective vaccination work. And it all involves having trusted conveyors of the message in every community. Everything from all of those very specific things to things like public participatory budgeting. I'm looking for candidates who care about participatory budgeting and maybe show up at some of those meetings. In other words, people that want to really, vitalize, I don't know whether we can say revitalize, but give life to local democracy. It's New York, I think, is a sort of great brewing pot for all those things. And I'm excited to see what comes of it in the form of our local government.
So your mention of FDR sets up my last question perfectly, because he obviously advanced an incredibly bold agenda that reshaped the role of government in American society. And he won, I think, most of, if not all, his 4 elections by very considerable margins. He was not squeaking it out on election night to see who would win. And that's been a question on my mind, looking at the Trump phenomenon, the number of working class whites who do support him, people who you might think would have more common cause with working class allies who are Black and brown. And the question kind of raised implicitly by Biden's acceptance speech, which I think was quite well done and somewhat moving, of is it possible to achieve more unity and a sense of consensus in the country, relatively speaking, and have a progressive and bold agenda? Do those two things, can you square those two things? Or is there this feeling that in order to bring more Americans along and heal some of these divisions, we have to stick to what people identify as the political center? What do you think of that? And is that our mission? Is our mission as progressives and Americans to try to develop a larger governing majority? Or is it enough to achieve change by a narrow vote so long as we get it?
Well, lots of things there. I mean, as I was reminded on my show right before the election, I had Maria Hinojosa and great guests, Zephyr Teachout, all giving us their best thoughts in the run up to the election. And the subject of the New Deal came up, and I was reminded, of course, by our guests that the New Deal was not perfect, left lots of people out, farm workers, domestic workers. It was famously attentive to the needs of white male breadwinners, but not everyone else. Maria also reminded me that there were mass deportations that took place during that time called the repatriations. And so I think, we can do better than that. We have to do better than that this time. And I think what people are really talking about when they revive the story of the New Deal is boldness, a bold vision informed by movements at the time, informed by unions, informed by organizing, urgency, and a sense that we have to be bold if we're going to survive, I think is what raised people's, what lives on in the memory of the New Deal, not just the programs. And that's what we need today. And I don't think you achieve bold vision and that sense of urgency that then propels the building of a movement to support that vision by starting with, we have to have unity, by starting with trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Look, I think Biden failed to connect issues during the campaign and allowed Donald Trump to claim the the territory of the economy and jobs, while Biden claimed public health. And those two were not brought together by Biden or anyone else, as to say, we have to have an economy that is healthy for everybody. And that means jobs, that means public health, that means a Green New Deal, and here's why. We need to talk, I think, those of us in the chattering classes, about economic inequality and division being a threat to public health. And that if we don't figure out how to provide to the needs of the most vulnerable and jobs to the most frustrated and a sense of a future to those who are most scared about that future, then we are going to be vulnerable to epidemic after epidemic after epidemic of violence, of hunger, of disease, of environmental devastation. But we can have a vision, I think, that says, look, we all need to come together to achieve XXX, and there is enough for everybody. Yes, we need to make some changes, but we need to do this together. I think you have to lead with boldness. I do. I don't think you can lead with, can we get everybody on the boat and make sure that the structure is comfortable for everyone. It's not going to be comfortable for everybody, but we are in an urgent situation. And I think that actually, I think that Biden and Harris, their personalities could pull it off. Whether their policy agendas will, and the environment in which they operate and their personal ambitions will allow them, I don't know. But it's not up to them, it's up to us, as we know.
Well, Laura Flanders is unlikely to be a member of Joe Biden's cabinet, but she will nonetheless be an important voice over the next 4 years, as she has long been. Laura, thank you so much for helping us to map out some of the groundwork at this early stage.
You're so welcome. Keep it up. Keep up the great work at City Limits.